Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to your Daily Penguin. This is our slow march, our waddle of the penguins through my penguin wall. We're going author by author and book by book. And a little while ago, I, in a fit of organizational frenzy, decided to try to organize that wall just a bit. I didn't get much farther than the ancient world, but I did at least do that. So all of 2020 so far has been the ancient world. There's been no hopping around. And it's been mostly ancient Greece and Rome, with a digression to the book of Psalms. And today we're doing another digression. Today we're doing a civilization that was ancient long before the ancient Hebrews or the ancient Greeks or the ancient Romans came along, and that's ancient Egypt. An intensely old and literary society, and that Penguin has not entirely neglected. I have two volumes I want to show you from the Penguin Classic Collection. The first one is by Toby Wilkinson. It's translated by Toby Wilkinson, who wrote, in 2010, he wrote a really good book called The Rise and Fall of Ancient Egypt. Well worth your time, especially if you can find it, at Book Depository or something like that. I keep meaning to look for it on Book Depository myself and see if there's a nice UK trade paperback. But he did a volume, I think this was probably in 2010 as well. No, this was 2016. He did a volume for Penguin Classic called Writings from Ancient Egypt that gives you a real good idea of how foreverly busy the ancient Egyptians were at writing. This has wonderful selections from private letters, mortuary inscriptions, legal contracts, religious documents, royal inscriptions, royal documentary, just scraps of autobiography. There's everything in the world in here except what we in the modern West would probably first look for, which is fiction, novels. The ancient Egyptians leave us an enormous bulk of literary remains, but a lot of it is very utilitarian. A lot of it is the literary remains of contracts on shipments of pomegranates or bills of lading that have little squibs attached to them. A bill of lading for, I don't know, a shipment of beer that has a little document saying, "and don't cheat me this time," something like that. A little note saying that. You have to sniff around for stuff like that, but Wilkinson is great at navigating this world. He knows it really well. So this volume is not only great for the samples that it gives you, but also for the explanations. One of the things that I love about Penguin Classics, one of the things that keeps me coming back to them, is the editorial apparatus. The critical apparatus for the volumes is usually very, very good, and that's certainly the case here. This is the latest volume about ancient Egypt that Penguin Classics has done, but they also have one other volume, of course, because the ancient Egyptian world leaves us a towering masterpiece that is as inscrutable and impenetrable as they were, and that is the Book of the Dead. And Penguin Classic makes a great, big, fat Book of the Dead. This is, there it is right here. It's 3 times the size of the Wilkinson book, and I love this as a decision to give us the Book of the Dead in its entirety, even though it is largely incomprehensible as a work of literature. It is a gigantic collection of incantations and religious rituals. So there's only a very limited way in which this can be read for pleasure by a modern audience. A very limited way. You have to come at it from the right angle. You have to be interested in it for the right things. You certainly can't pick it up like you would a volume of Herodotus. And this is not the only book like that Penguin makes. They infamously make, we will be getting to it, they infamously make a Penguin Classic Deluxe edition of the Domesday Book, which is not a book at all. It's an inventory. This is very close to being that. But the joy of this volume is that for this volume, Penguin Classics decided to reprint a classic edition of this work for all of the right reasons. There was, in the Victorian era, I want to see who gives you the introduction here. John Romer gives you the introduction here, and he's a very good historian of ancient Egypt. But the translation here of the Egyptian Book of the Dead is E.A. Wallace Budge, whose name might be familiar to some of you if you have ever, in the course of your used book travels, encountered anything about ancient Egypt. it's almost certainly been a Wallace Budge volume. He was a great monomaniacal Victorian Egyptologist. He was the quintessential Victorian Egyptologist, going and documenting and buying and sometimes looting, filling Western museums, one in particular, with all the spoils of his scholarly searches in Egypt, and also writing and translating about ancient Egypt at a furious clip. He did more than any single individual to popularize ancient Egypt, to make it known to the Western world, to make it attractive to the Western world. And he did this translation of the Book of the Dead. I don't even know when. I wonder if this will tell me. 1923. 1923 he did this translation. And Penguin... oh my. Oh, this edition has a postcard in it. Is it going to be apropos? Oh, it is going to be apropos. Oh my, it's a little bit old. They give us. I want to make sure that you can see this. They give us the original typeset from 1923. They just present the volume that Budge created for the reading public in London. And in his introduction, Romer says something very important. I've mentioned it on this Daily Penguin feature many times, and I want to read it to you to underscore that I wish Penguin would do this more often. In his new introduction, he says, "This book is a part of our intellectual history. Just as John Bull is British, the Eiffel Tower is French, and God often speaks in King James English, so this particular Book of the Dead is an integral part of what we now call ancient Egypt." And it's owing to Budge that is true. That's the reason. The editorial decision here could have been practical. It could be that there just wasn't a more up-to-date version to hand, or that was affordable. But I would like to believe Romer on his word. I would like to believe that the reason that the editorial board decided to run the Budge translation of the Book of the Dead, and of course it has modern updates and abridgments and notes and whatnot, but it's 99% Budge. And I would like to think the reason that they decided to do this for their Penguin Classic Book of the Dead is for that reason. Not because Budge was necessarily the most up-to-date. Of course, the archaeology, the interpretations, his method of writing has changed in 100 years, so that no one would write a book like this now, but because of the impact that his own book made, apart from being a translation of another book. I love that as a decision, and I wish in a perfect world where Penguin Classic had all the distribution, all the audience, and all the money in the world, I would love it if they did that regularly. I would love it if we had a Penguin Classic, a big deluxe edition, a Penguin Classic of the Quiller Couch Oxford Book of English Verse, of the Florio Montaigne, not necessarily just the most modern translation of Montaigne, but the Florio translation that was their translation forever. What about the North Plutarch or the Dryden Plutarch? I would love that. I would absolutely love that. I would love it if there's a Penguin Classic, Black Spine Penguin Classic of the Shakespeare's First Folio. The thinking on the editorial board here, and no doubt spurred by the fact that these books end up in classes a lot of the time, and so they must hear from teachers. The thinking is to make the editorial presentation, the translation, the notes, all of it, as up-to-date as possible. And I guess I understand that. I just wish there were a parallel track to preserve and honor the translations and interpretations that came before, like Budge, where no one would call him cutting-edge Egyptology anymore, but I would be willing to peg it at a fairly high number of working Egyptologists in the field today, especially English-speaking working Egyptologists in the field today who weren't inspired by Budge. I would be willing to bet the vast majority of them were, in one way or another. And everybody who's read anything about ancient Egypt has come across this guy. It's not embarrassing. It's extremely good and very vigorous. He has his quirks, but all authors do. All translators do. So I loved this decision. And I go back to this book. I don't go back to it in the way that I do most of the others, because it's not meant to do that. I go back to get a feel for the ancient Egyptians. And what this book is largely them in secular rest. They're in secular rest in this book. They're saying, I am moving from one city to another. I'm loading up carts. Before I do that, I'm going to make an inventory of my household. Every item and the condition that it's in, and where I want it, and how I got it, and where it's packed, and whatnot. And that just happens to survive. Or somebody will write a letter to somebody else, and it just happens to survive. It's nothing momentous, nothing important. This is the quotidian ancient Egypt. Whereas this is the ancient Egyptians in fits of ecstasy. This is the book that provided the architecture for the weird social world in which they lived, which was as much about the afterlife as it was about the current life. In a way that would see, the more you read about it, the more excessive it seems, even to, like, for instance, a hysterically Christian country like modern-day America, where Christians are thinking about the afterlife, or at least they claim they are a lot. Most of the Christians that I've met seem to be thinking a lot more about somebody else's afterlife than their own. But one way or another, their religion tells them. How did the Amy Grant song go? We're just here to learn to love him. In a little while, we'll be home. This is not... The Christian religion in this country teaches its fundamentalist adherents, anyway, that the world is a testing ground, a trialing ground, a waiting room for your real life, which starts when you die. Even that kind of an attitude, which is very strong in America now, and it has been much stronger in the Christian West in centuries past, even that is a shadow of what the Egyptians thought about. It's fair to say that the afterlife and all the permutations of it just obsessed them. And this is that. This is the book of that. This is the book of the prayers, of the preparations, the prayers for dying at night, the prayers for dying during the day, the prayers for dying in the fullness of your health, the prayers for dying young, the prayers that are to be chanted as your funeral procession wends its way to your tomb. And those prayers will be different if they're on special festive occasions. Those prayers will be different if certain gods are in the ascendancy. Those prayers will be different if it's daylight or nighttime, if it's in the season of the Nile or if it's in drought. And this is just the whole compendium of them all. It's not really something you can pull off the shelf and say, well, I really want a chapter. But if I'm, for instance, reading a novel set in ancient Egypt, or a murder mystery set in ancient Egypt, there are quite a few ongoing, there were once upon a time, quite a few ongoing murder mysteries set in ancient Egypt, then this is great for getting the scent back, for seeing this. You can learn, you can tell a lot from a people by the Penguin Classic entombed version of their mortuary rites, of their liturgical ceremonies. Same thing with the Book of Common Prayer. I would strongly recommend this volume, but not for narrative reading. I don't want you to think you can pick this up, unlike, for instance, the Book of Common Prayer, which you can pick up and read. Or, in a much more tenuous comparison, the Bible. You could pick it up and read it. The Book of the Dead, you can't really do that, even though Penguin themselves made a volume 10 years ago, something like that, called How to Read the Egyptian Book of the Dead. It's still... I go to it for atmosphere more than for engrossment. But I'm so glad that Penguin made it. This is just a lovely volume. And that is your Penguin for today. It's ancient Egypt. So we have the secular and the sacred writings of ancient Egypt. I would have wished that the secular version would be as long as the other one. We certainly have the material, but the selecting is really good, and it's by a really smart guy. So I'll take it, definitely. And we're gonna finish there. That is your Daily Penguin for today. I have no more ancient Egypt writings, so we will move on back to ancient Greece and Rome, I would imagine. And I'll see you then. Thank you, BookTube.